Welles was going through a rather disastrous patch in his career. Prior to Lady from Shanghai, he'd made a movie. He'd been sort of allowed to make a movie again, thanks to Sam Spiegel, thanks to John Huston but letting the stranger go. He had more interesting projects to develop, and so Welles was taken on board, but with very strict instructions from Spiegel as to what he could do, what he couldn't do, and he made the film under more constricted circumstances than any other film that he made, and it's not an entirely satisfactory piece of work, but it actually made quite a decent amount of money for the studio, but not for Welles. So he'd been pursuing all sorts of other careers as a journalist, writing initially sort of light-hearted journalism, and then eventually quite heavy-duty political analysis, neither of which found much favour. He had attempted a career on radio, both as a commentator and as a comedian, and astonishingly enough, at some point had subbed for Jack Benny on his show. I mean, brave, but not his natural gift, you know. And so he was really desperate. And then he tried what he also thought might be a good money-making wheeze, which was to do a musical of Around the World in 80 Days, adaptation of the Jules Verne novel, of course. And he seemed to have a lot going for him. He managed to get a score by Cole Porter, then at his zenith. He managed to enter into a partnership with Mike Todd, who was a very powerful and wealthy producer, and he became very, very ambitious. And he filled the stage with all kinds of extraordinary visions of Japanese theatre, of the Rocky Mountains, railways crashing across the stage, and so on. By this point, he lost the confidence of Mike Todd, who pulled out when Welles suggested putting real oil derricks on the stage. And so Mike Todd departed, and with him all his money, and so Welles had to raise the money again. It turned out that the Cole Porter score was an absolute dud. There's nothing even faintly memorable in the score. And Welles took a huge Broadway theatre and did a couple of out-of-town dates, which were just utter mayhem, and rewrote the play constantly, changing the part that he was playing innumerable parts in the final show, and it opened on Broadway with the memorable headline from Variety magazine, "Welles a floppin'." It was for some people delightful, because it celebrated the old Variety style of show, the Kiralfy brothers and Barnum and Bailey and so on, but it was incoherent and just probably too much. So Welles was left, after it folded finally, with vast debts, and also owing the IRS an awful lot of money. So he was desperate to find something else to do, and he was also desperate to get back to making movies, which is, after all, his principal passion. And so when his old enemy, Harry Cohn of Columbia Pictures, invited him to make a movie, he didn't hesitate to say yes, because it featured Rita Hayworth. Rita wanted to make a film with Orson. Again, they'd been parted for about a year. The divorce had come through in about 10 months before, but Rita still, it seems, hankered after Welles, both as a man and as an artist. And Welles was genuinely very fascinated by Rita Hayworth as an actress, and thought it would be a fine and interesting thing to do. And first of all, he wanted to make a film of Carmen with Rita, which of course would have been terrific box office. It's a terribly good idea from a commercial point of view, but Cohn didn't want that, and nor I think probably did Rita. She was sick of playing those sultry Latin sex bombs. She'd just had a huge success with Gilda, which had crystallized her image forever with the movie-going public, who absolutely adored her. So Wells was looking for a property, and a chap called William Castle had come to him a couple of years before, having acquired the rights in a book called If I Die Before I Wake, which is a typical noir novel, rather well written, rather well conceived, quite elegant, quite literate, a very good read still, I would say. And he brought it to Wells, and Wells had sort of rather liked it, but nothing much had happened. The idea was for Bill Castle to direct it and Wells to play the central character, who in the novel is called Larry Planter. Time passed, and Castle heard nothing more. And then he was working at Columbia and was ushered into Harry Cohn's office, and Harry Cohn said, "Great news, Orson's discovered this fabulous novel. It's called If I Die Before I Wake, and he'd like you to be the associate producer on it." So Wells had pulled another fast one. He often said that he'd just seen the book lying around on somebody's, the stage doorkeeper's wicket, and happened to pick it up. All completely untrue. He knew the book, and he knew that it was good, and so he adapted it into a screenplay which draws substantially on the original novel. The most significant change he made was to convert the leading character, Larry Planter, into a big Irishman, which would then be his part, called Mike Black Irish O'Hara. And so it gave Orson a chance to use his much vaunted Irish accent. But he decided to do he made certain considerable changes to the novel geographically, particularly, and set it all over parts of America, Acapulco, San Francisco, and so on, Fire Island, and all the various locations. So it was a big, big movie he was planning, 2.5 million, which is a lot for the time. And he had a very radical idea, which was, for the time, for 1946-7, it was a shocking, a blasphemous idea, which was to dye Rita Hayworth's hair blonde. She was the redhead of all time. She was defined, that brunette kind of beauty. And it was a terribly bold move, which Harry Cohn was appalled by, but Rita Hayworth was delighted because she wanted to change her image. She wanted to push herself. She wanted to remake herself. Admirable ambition in that way to improve herself as an artist. And Wells had always made her feel intelligent, and no man had ever made her feel that before. And indeed, she was, it seems, still quite keen on reviving their relationship, even though they divorced. So there was quite a fraught emotional atmosphere on the movie from that point of view. Also, it was a fantastically hard shoot because of all the locations and the cumbersomeness of Columbia's units. It was very hard to get the thing actually shot, and they filmed in places where the climate was entirely antagonistic to Wells particularly, who suffered terribly from sinusitis and from asthma and all of that stuff. And even Rita Hayworth got ill too. Everybody was ill at one point or another. It was a very hard shoot. Really, really difficult for everybody. Wells had no difficulty with the actors. They were terrific. A lot of them had come from his Mercury Theatre days and Citizen Kane. People like Everett Sloane in a leading part, actually, probably the best role Everett Sloane ever had, the crippled lawyer Bannister. And Gus Schilling, and the wonderful Broadway actor Glenn Anders, who plays Grisby, who is Bannister's partner and the most sinister figure in the film, and an absolutely dazzlingly brilliant performance, quite extraordinary. The performance that was problematic was Wells's own, apart from the fact that he was directing the movie and working insane hours, hardly sleeping at all, feeding himself amphetamines to keep his weight down. He trades or tries to trade on his charm, but it's kind of rather, it's a bit recycled, the charm, and it's sad for the film that that's the case, because so much of the rest of the film is inspired from a visual point of view, particularly. Of course, the film as we have it is scarcely the film that Welles intended to make, because Harry Cohn was naturally very intent on focusing on his star. And so the studio ordered a large number of pickups, of close-ups, particularly of Rita, the very thing that Welles was trying to avoid, both for Rita's own sake and for the movie's sake. He didn't want to present her as she had been, as just a sort of sex bomb or as a great beauty, but as a complex and driven and destructive woman. Nonetheless, the film has extraordinary tone, and when one considers that, as always, Welles had used sound in a most innovative way and worked out an extraordinary, elaborate score, a sequence of catches of sound, very often coming from sources. He was to do the same thing in Touch of Evil later, all of which was overruled by the studio, who provided him with an extraordinarily anodyne score by Heinz Rohmheld, recycling a pop song, which comes back again and again and again. So once again, Welles, having had an extraordinary vision for a film, was scuppered, by the studio, which was extraordinarily hands-on in its interventions. The editor was under strict instructions from Harry Cohn. So scuppered by that, and then by the problem of Welles's own central performance in the film. Nonetheless, as every film student knows, it contains some of the greatest bravura sequences in post-war cinema. The famous sequence in the Crazy House is staggering. The use of the mirrors, which is not unprecedented. I mean, there's a sequence not unlike it in Chaplin's film, The Circus. Welles was a great student of Chaplin's films and a great admirer, and nonetheless, he goes much further than Chaplin in his use of it, and having a shootout in the center of that sequence is just an inspired idea, and it's just a slice of Welles's pure genius there. You really, really have to acknowledge that this is one of the most brilliant uses of film conceivable. It's a purely cinematic sequence, and there are a number of sequences in the film which are similarly dreamlike, nightmare-like. That was what Welles was after all the way through the film. Welles very definitely had in his mind a kind of expressionist aesthetic, to the extent that he got together all his crew and some of the cast and showed them the cabinet of Dr. Caligari. This was the starting point and the inspiration for the style of the movie. So, for example, there's a court sequence which is like something out of Alice in Wonderland. It's just absolute madness, all intended by Welles to present a skewed, disturbed picture of the world. Harry Cohn and his cohorts were meanwhile trying to do the exact opposite and to bring it back down to just an ordinary thriller with a famous actress at the center of it. So I suppose one must be very grateful that as much of Welles's original genius survives in the film. Of course, Welles came from radio, and Welles had been one of the great innovators in radio, and he brought everything that was Kenneth Tynan famously said that the second time that he saw Citizen Kane, he watched it with his eyes closed, and it was an equally intense experience because the soundscape, that's sort of Wells almost as often having a sort of visionary anticipation, and that even as the film stands, there's an awful lot of rather marvelous sound texture in the film. But it's very interesting that this is what Wells does, and what Wells is so often prevented from realizing is he'll never just shoot a story straight. He has to skew it in some kind of way, transform it, partly just out of showmanship, just to be surprising and electrifying, but also out of a particular vision of the world. Wells's vision of life is essentially rather nightmarish. It is essentially a bleak and pessimistic view, and he does so often propose a character, as in the case with Michael O'Hara, who is essentially an innocent who doesn't really, just has no idea what's going on. He's outwitted all the time, which of course could well be said of Orson Welles, the cleverest man on the planet, who was constantly outwitted by much less intelligent people than he was, which is a conundrum. And I once had a conversation with Mike Nichols about Wells, just before Mike died, and he said, you know, it's easy. These people who run studios are dumb. It's so easy to get on top of them. He said when he did his first film, Mike did his first film, Who Was Afraid of Virginia Woolf, they wanted to impose the writer Ernest Lehman, probably pronounced Lehman in America, on him. And he didn't think highly of Lehman, and he said no. And they said, well, then we're going to sack you. And he said, well, that'll be a shame for you, because I've just spoken to Richard Burton and Elizabeth Taylor, and they said, if I go, they're going too. So perhaps you won't have a movie at all. And they caved in. Of course they did. They said it's as simple as that. You just have to think a bit about it. But Wells was sort of, it's rather lordly, you know, a rather aristocratic view of how, you know, things will happen for him because he is the signor, the lord, the great creative master. But movies don't work like that because they're very cost intensive and somebody's putting up an awful lot of money. And in the end, you have to work with them. You can't work against them. Wells never bought that idea at all. The Harry Kern thing was a real car crash in those terms. It's one of the great sadnesses in Wells's output, because I think it had the potential to be utterly extraordinary. The thing about Wells, one of the crucial things about Wells, is that he'd been told from the cradle that he was a genius. And events seemed to prove that to be a correct estimate, because everything he touched, right up until the age of 25, turned into magic. When he worked on the radio, it turned into magic. When he worked at the Mercury Theatre, it turned into magic. And when he did Citizen Kane, it turned into magic. Clearly, he was a remarkable person. That's in his own estimation. But he never understood that you have to work at these things. He never worked at these things. It was beneath him. John Huston, a similarly anarchic spirit, as you might say, was never precocious like Wells. John Huston worked incredibly hard for everything, and he spent 10 years in Paris working on his writing, thinking a lot, living a lot, absorbing all these things, but not producing any work. Then he went back to Hollywood, was given a job in the script department of Warner Brothers, and decided to do an adaptation of the Dashiell Hammett novel, Maltese Falcon, and they liked it so much that they invited him to direct it. But this is no kind of whiz kid. This is somebody who's advanced slowly and cautiously, using his charm very carefully and sparingly, and having formulated what he thought very carefully, and having a great sense of clarity about his purposes. And so when The Maltese Falcon was a success, he was immediately asked to do 5 or 6 or 7 movies, and his career never really faltered. He just went on and on and on making movies, some of which are not remarkable, some of which are very remarkable indeed. But he never saw himself as a genius. He never saw himself as this kind of huge primary creative force, which Wells, with reason, felt himself to be. But he was working in movies where you need the support and the backing of everybody. He never quite understood that.